Yes.
I need people to tell me yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Do you want me to babysit it? Or?
Nah, I think it'll be okay. All right. Looks good. I have no clue. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Mary. Shakespeare was Shakespeare, the man from Stratford upon Avon. And I want to talk a little bit to start us off about the way we think about Shakespeare now. So we often like to kind of memorialize Shakespeare as this solitary genius, right, with his ink-stained fingers, working alone in his study. But really, Shakespeare was part of a much wider network of collaborative writing that came out of the Elizabethan theater in the late 1570s, in the 1580s, going through into the early Jacobean period. So the reason we read Shakespeare in our high schools, sometimes even middle schools, right, all the way through college today, can't escape him, he's everywhere, is because his plays are a little more accessible to us 450 years later than some of his fellow contemporaries. And I can say this with a bit of authority because I have read a number of these plays of his contemporaries, and they require often a lot of footnotes, a lot of details about the city of London that Shakespeare doesn't really include in his plays. He actually doesn't set a single one of his plays in his contemporary London. So if you think about all of the movies or sitcoms we watch today, how most of them are all set in modern day 2013 New York or LA, Shakespeare would have been doing something very different in response to his contemporaries, not setting plays in his contemporary time and place. Because of this choice, they often are a bit more relatable for us today. His plays often explore what English teachers sometimes call the human condition more broadly instead of contemporary politics or social issues. So topics like jealousy, greed, ambition, loyalty, forbidden love, intergenerational conflict, and aging, all of which are topics that we can still relate to today. So I want to talk a little bit about the basics of the London playhouses and the playing companies, just so you can get a good overview, basic 5-minute overview of the environment from which Shakespeare was writing. So here we have a little sketch, and it's a sketch of a copy of a sketch drawn by a visitor to London of the Swan Theatre, which was fairly similar to the Globe Theatre. There are a number of theatres sprouting up, 1570s, 1580s, 1590s. Sometimes they burn down, sometimes they have to rebuild them. This gives you an idea of the general setup for what we think these theaters may look like. Now, scholars debate this to an extent, but we can agree for the most part that these outdoor theaters were open air, so they did not have a roof, a thatched roof covering the entire space. So we'll come back to that at the end of class today. And they also had a kind of 3/4 theater in the round type feel. So if you've ever been to a theater with a thrust stage, it's a bit different than that proscenium stage, that picture box stage that really comes in later. It's kind of what we've all grown up with in our middle school and high school auditoriums. A little bit different than the theater space that you would have seen here. You can also see that there would have been seating in different levels around the sides. Perhaps seating in the back, we're not sure about that, but perhaps for the people that want to both see and be seen, wouldn't really give you a great view of the play. You're just seeing everything backwards, but everyone would be looking at you. And then also there'd be space in front and perhaps to the sides of the stage for what we would call the groundlings, right? So the cheaper seats where you would just stand for the whole performance. And as we know from Romeo and Juliet in the prologue that it's supposed to be a 2 hours traffic of the stage, these plays were supposedly over and done with in 2 hours, so they weren't really fixed, right? So if you've ever been to a production of Hamlet, they can sometimes drag on upwards of 4 hours. Would have been a lot quicker. So thinking about all of these things as we encounter them here, pacing, environment, stage space, things of that nature. Now, if you wanted to seat up high, better seat, you actually want to sit down, pay a little more for it. If you wanted a cushion, that was extra as well. So going to the theater today, you often get all dressed up, right? It's like going to the opera, going to the ballet. We're very quiet, we're very respectful, we clap politely. All right, environment very different in the Elizabethan theater and early Jacobean theater. Essentially, you have your day off, all right? You want to go to the theater. You have some choices once you get there, okay? You can choose to go see a play, maybe a new play by Marlowe, maybe a play by Shakespeare, or you could choose to go to an ale house, get drunk. You could choose to go to a brothel right down the street, see some prostitutes, or maybe you get distracted on the way and you find yourself in a theater that looks very much like this, watching some bears and some dogs fight. All right, so this is the common entertainment. bear baiting, prostitution, drinking, and Shakespeare. So it adds a little bit of a different environment for the way we think about these plays. Keep this in mind. This is an early modern map of London from the 1570s. You can see over here, maybe you can't quite see, but I promise, trust me, they're there. There's two round circular buildings here, theaters, bear baiting theaters. They're often labeled differently in different maps. But you see that this is actually separated from the rest of the city. All right, so here's London Bridge, the only bridge in London at this time. Here's the Tower of London. And the city, for the most part, is over on the other side of the lake. All right, so this area that the theaters were in was called the Liberties. And it did have a lot to do with freedom, right? It's outside of the regular bounds of the city of London, so they could get away with more, right? Censorship didn't affect them as much. That's why they could put the brothels over there, right? That's why they could have all the alehouses over there. So thinking about the place of the theater, the actual theater structure itself, which we just talked about, but then also the location of the theaters themselves in the city of London, and how this relates to the freedom that these playwrights had to comment on contemporary politics, social issues, and to add some critiques right in there as well. So being in the actual region of the Liberties allowed them some liberty in their plays. So some of the basics of the, all right, I'm going to get to this in a second, so I'm going to go back. Some of the basics of these playing companies. Shakespeare wrote for Lord Chamberlain's Men, which then became the King's Men in 1603 when Queen Elizabeth died and King James I took over. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. They used very similar companies, right? So if you think of like the Frat Pack with the Will Ferrell movies that all come out, right? They all kind of play similar roles. Similar kind of thing was happening in these companies as well. So we often think of Shakespeare as Elizabethan, but most of his greatest plays, his greatest hits, were actually written in the Jacobean period, after 1603. So this includes Hamlet, Othello, Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, Ritter's Tale. So the Jacobean period is named after King James I. You've heard a little bit about him already. We'll get more into him today. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who, as you may remember from last week's lectures, was killed off by Queen Elizabeth. She sent that letter, right, saying, "Kill Mary," and then she sent one saying, "Oh no, I changed my mind," but sent it knowingly too late. All right, so his mother had been killed by Elizabeth. He was the King of Scotland. So King James VI of Scotland is the same person as King James I of England. It's a little tricky. And as he was brought over to rule after Elizabeth, he unified England, Scotland, and Ireland. So there was a lot of anxiety about King James's ascension to the throne. As we know, Elizabeth didn't have children. The safest way to pass the throne on is to pass it to your son. So she didn't have sons, she didn't have a daughter. We're going to see some of these issues about ascension and legitimacy of rule come up in Lear as well. Some of these anxieties happening in 1603, clearly on the mind of our playwright as he's working on this play. The transition, however, actually went fairly smoothly, though he was known for playing favorites at his court. He granted a number of new titles and liked to give out land, hearing echoes of King Lear here. Some of the concerns about playing favorites connects to some of the anxieties we've already seen in this class about being a courtier, which we've discussed in respect to Wyatt at the court of Henry VIII. Perhaps we've discussed a little bit in respect to Spencer at the court of Elizabeth. So how do I act as a good advisor, right, to these leaders? How do I act as a good courtier to them? How do I give them advice? How do I tell them the truth, right, when they actually don't want to hear what I'm telling them? So King Lear is ultimately written at a time when issues surrounding an aging ruler and the ascension of the throne were at the forefront of subjects' minds. Now, King James was not all fun and games, right? He spent a lot of money, had a lot of titles, had some favorites at court, but he also was a political writer. So he published The True Law of Free Monarchies, which is kind of his, one of his theories on leadership and kingship, and also the Silicon Doron, which is translated as Gifts for the King, which he wrote for his son, teaching him how to rule. So these were read very furiously when people realized he may be taking over after Elizabeth, because they didn't figure out what kind of leader he would be. Also the King James Bible in English, if you've heard the phrase, if it ain't King James, it ain't Bible. I don't know if anyone's heard that. But yeah, it's out there. It's a language we're still pretty familiar with today that people tend to like, with all the these and thys. Here is a family tree of the Tudor family. So you can see that things were a little dicey. It wasn't totally clear who would inherit the throne. But here's James with his wife, clearly showing, again, a family tree, asserting his claim. Right? So there's some issues with who should inherit, is this legitimate or not, but saying, yes, it is, right? And using actual visual language and maps to do so. All right, so some of Shakespeare's sources for King Lear. As opposed to that image of him sitting independent as this solitary genius in his study, he's actually pulling sources from a number of different places. He's not coming up with all of these ideas for his plays completely independently. So some of his sources include the history of the kings of Britain back from the 1100s, Holinshed's Chronicles, which tell a lot of stories about British history, British past, even Spenser's The Fairy Queen, so thinking back to Spenser, which we talked about last class, does a few stanzas in one of his cantos about the King Lear story. There was also an anonymous play that was performed in the 1590s that was not written by Shakespeare, King Lear, L-E-I-R, that we have a record of. And then there was also this topical case, the Annesley case, that was brought in kind of a court of law. So I'll talk a little bit about that. This is from The Fairy Queen. So you can see eldest Goneril, Regan, greater love to him professed. Cordelia said she loved him. Right? So we see this in other sources before King Lear. These are the letters regarding the Annesley case. So a old man has land, he has 3 children, and his oldest daughter wants to have him declared mentally incompetent and unfit to manage his property so that she can inherit it all. So this is their letter trying to argue that their father has fallen into such imperfection and distemperature of mind and memory. His youngest daughter defended him and asked that he not be recorded and registered as a lunatic. And she was successful, and she inherited his land. Right? So this is happening in 1603, right around the time Lear is beginning to percolate in Shakespeare's mind. This is the cover page to the anonymous 1590s play. So King Lear's text, there are really 4 competing texts here. We have 2 different quartos. Quartos and folios refer to the way a page is folded. So a folio is folded once, hence folio, and a quarto, like in elementary school, it's folded twice, and then they cut the edges. So it's little. So the quartos are kind of like singles. You guys remember the single CDs you could buy, right, versus full albums? And the folio is more of a collection that came later after Shakespeare's death. So we have 2 quartos, we have a folio, and then we have the conflated text, and this is the one that you have in your Northern anthology. So the quarto is often thought to be more authorial in nature, whereas the folio is sometimes thought to be more theatrical, as if it came from a prompt book. So there are many different versions of these texts circulating. There's no one authoritative text. And this goes for, the most part, all of Shakespeare's plays. So even when we only have one record of the text, it could have been quite different from what was actually performed. And all performances are a little bit different too. On the left, you see the quarto. You can see that it's called the True Chronicle History in the quarto version. And in the later folio version, it's called the Tragedy of King Lear. So we have this kind of conflation of genre happening here as well. On the one hand, the earlier plays thought of as a history, the other hand, the later one as a tragedy. So I think this makes a difference in the way we read the play if we read it as a history versus reading it as a tragedy. If we read it as a history, it becomes more about the nation. It becomes more about England. If we read it as a tragedy, it becomes more personal. It becomes about humanizing that monarch, right, in a different way. So it kind of makes sense that the history version comes first, the tragedy version may come second, as we're moving through the Renaissance, getting a little bit later into the period, thinking about the role of the individual, a bit more interiority, introspection, and that kind of thing. So moving perhaps away from that larger national narrative that we've seen from the earlier Middle Ages, and moving into more individual tragedy. All right, so now I'd like to start doing some readings with you guys. So if you guys can turn to page 1254, this is when the play begins. So the very first scene, Act 1, Scene 1 of King Lear, is often referred to as the map scene. And in people's memories, we often think of the play beginning, right, with Lear coming out with the map. And actually, that's not the very first thing that we see happening here. So we actually find out from the very first lines that Lear plays favorites. Okay, so this is going back to those favoritism at court issues that we've discussed already. Kent says, I thought the king had more affected the Duke of Albany than Cornwall. So I thought he liked Albany better than he liked Cornwall. Gloucester replies, it didn't always seem so to us, so I always thought he was his favorite. But now, in the division of the kingdom, it appears not which of the dukes he values most, for equalities are so weighed that curiosity in neither can make choice of either's loyalty. So here he's saying, we thought that he was playing favorites, but now it's kind of hard to tell, right? He's divided up the land, it seems pretty equal, we're not really sure. All right. We get this again around line 35 when Lear finally does appear with his map. He says, meantime, we shall express our darker purpose. And darker here is glossed in your text as secret. So he has a secret to share. Give me the map there. Know that we have divided in 3 our kingdom. Now he says this is a darker purpose. He says this is a secret. But Kent and Gloucester seem to know all about it, right? They're already in on the secret. So we're already confronting a court that knows more than Lear, right? Where there's tensions between who knows what, where's the knowledge, right? Does the king actually control information in this court already when he's still in power? From the very first line back in Scene 1, that's already thrown into question. Know that we have divided in 3 our kingdom, and 'tis our fast intent to take all cares and business from our age, and burden them on younger strengths, while we, unburthened, crawl towards death. So this is Lear's fantasy here. He's going to divide up the kingdom so that he can be unburdened, so he doesn't have to work anymore. Around line 47, he initiates his test for his daughters. He says, tell me, my daughters, since now we will divest us, both of rule, interest of territory, cares of state, which of you shall we say doth love us most, that we our largest bounty may extend, where nature doth with merit challenge. So here, again, he's expressing this fantasy. He wants to get rid of his rule, his interest of territory, his cares of state. So all of the dirty work, right? The tending to the land, making sure things are going well, looking to his account books, balancing that checkbook. He doesn't want to do that anymore, right? He's over it. So he wants to pass those cares, the cares of state, onto his children. And he says that he's going to challenge them, tell me which one loves me most, and whoever loves me most, I'll give them the largest bounty. I'll give them the largest share of land. Now already this is contradictory, right? Because we've heard from Gloucester and Kent that the land has been divided equally. We've also heard from Lear that the land has been divided equally. So we're starting to ask some questions. Can you actually divide up land equally? Right? Can you do this? Is it all equal? And if you think about it logically, well, no, right? Some land is going to have the capital city in it, and some land's going to have all the hunting ground, right? And some land's going to be, out in the middle of nowhere. I'm from a flyover state, but from flyover states, right? That kind of thing. So we have to think about, is land all equal, right? Is this equality that he's kind of suggesting here actually a possibility? Line 62, he does this again. Of all these bounds, even from this line to this line, this is when he's giving Goneril her land. With shadowy forests and with campaigns rich, with plenteous rivers and wide-skirted meads, we make thee lady. So he says, you get all the forest, right? You get all the forested land and the land with the rivers. That's for you, okay? Line 80, he does this for Regan. To be in thine, hereditary actor, remain this ample third of our fair kingdom. no less in space, validity, and pleasure than that conferred on Goneril. So she gets a second third. All right, so this is simple math. He has 3/3. He's already given away 2 specific thirds. So what does that leave us with? We know exactly what piece of land is meant for Cordelia. Right? We know exactly what piece is left, and everyone up on that stage knows too. Then he challenges Cordelia. He says, what can you say, this is line 85, what can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak. Now what can she do in this moment? Can she actually do anything to improve upon the lot that's already been given to her? She has the last third, right? You cut a cake into 3 pieces, you have 2 of them away, the last third's left, that's hers, right? It's pretty clear. So what can she do to draw a third more opulent than her sisters? And she says nothing. Nothing, my lord. Right? That's kind of true. But she can't do anything. It's already been divided. It's already been divided. So I'd like to think about this moment also as a tension between speaking and silence. Right? So speak, and she says nothing, but in speaking she actually is saying something. We have Goneril and Regan performing these very public, performative speeches. Goneril even claims at line 54, "Sir, I love you more than words can wield the matter." So I love you more than words can say, and yet I'm using words to tell you that. Right? I'm using language to say that language is not enough. So she's kind of messing with that idea of what the power of language actually is. Cordelia, on the other hand, speaks in asides up until the moment she says nothing. Literally says nothing. So the aside is this interesting theatrical device, right? Because it allows characters to have intimate access to the audience, to speak directly to them without being heard on the stage in the world of life. But it's also a hyper-theatrical device. It's a very theatrical device to have an aside, right? To have that kind of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, time out, right? Let me tell you, Zach Morris style, let me tell you something, right? Whisper to you and then go back into the scene. It's kind of what Cordelia's doing. So in saying, I need to speak to be honest, I need to access honesty, I need to speak directly to the audience, I need to be true. In doing that, she's also using a very hyper-theatrical device. Right? So there's this kind of contradiction in the way she's speaking. Just like there's a contradiction in the way Goneril's speaking. I love you more than words can wield the matter. Well, you just use words to say that words are not enough. Right? So there's a contradiction there. Cordelia is also caught between a rock and a hard place since her 2 suitors are kind of lurking around the palace, right? They're looking around the corner. And she cannot seem to dismiss them by saying she loves her father all. Right? So her speech begins at 95. She says, "Good, my lord, you have begot me, bred me, loved me. I return those duties back as our right fit, obey you, love you, and most honor you. I obey you, I love you, I honor you. Why have my sisters husbands, if they say they love you all? Haply, when I shall wed, that lord whose hand must take my plight shall carry half my love with him, half my care and duty. Sure, I shall never marry like my sisters, to love my father all." So here Cordelia is using this language of division, wholeness, halves, right? At the same time when Lear is thinking about, oh, I can divide this up equally, no problem. Not going to be an issue. There'll be enough for everyone to go around. It'll all work out. This will be perfect. I can go retire, we'll gamble in Florida, it'll be fantastic, right? He has this fantasy about this. But Cordelia is trying to bring some questions into that. How can I divide my love in half? How can I say I love you all, give you all, when actually I also need to give that to husbands? So there's these issues about all and nothing, right? Wholeness, fractions, parts, and wholes that are being brought up here. At line 225 in Act 1, Scene 1, this is after Cordelia has been dismissed from court, sent away, disowned. She tries to defend herself. She says, "I yet beseech your majesty, if for I want that glib and oily art, to speak and purpose not, to say things that I actually don't mean. Since what I well intend, I'll do it before I speak. That you make known it is no vicious blot, murder, or foulness, no unchaste action or dishonored step that hath deprived me of your grace and favor." So make sure everyone knows that I wasn't sleeping around, that I wasn't doing these horrible things. Make sure people know why was dismissed. But even for want of that for which I am richer, a still soliciting eye, and such a tongue as I am glad I have not, though not to have it hath lost me in your liking. So here Cordelia is saying, I lack the art, right? I lack the glib and oily art to cleverly manipulate my language, to manipulate my people. Right? I lack this art. I can only say what I feel. I can only say what I think. Of course, the irony here is that this is a very excellently crafted speech, right? So it's full of these very complicated grammatical moves. She has an aside in it, right, with the dashes separated out. So she's making these interesting rhetorical moves, even as she say, I lack the art. I lack this glib and oily art. Here. So again, we're confronting the role of language, and of course, if that's a theme in this play, it makes sense, right? Because the medium of theater is language, right? The medium of theater is language. And so the fact that we're messing with language, we're figuring out to what extent can language be true, to what extent can we say what we mean, and have that be enough, right? To say, I cannot tell you in words how I feel, and yet I will do it in words. Right? There's this contradiction here about language. So at the end of Act 1, Scene 1, Lear has banished not only his daughter, but also his trusted advisor Kent, who tries to talk some sense into him, right? Keeps interrupting him. But Lear! And he cries out, see better, Lear, right? Which creates some nice metaphors for us later about sight and blindness. This speaks to the danger of being an honest advisor at a king's court. So this relates back to Elizabeth I, James I, and even back all the way to Henry VIII, and some of the courtiers in their writings about this that we've seen earlier. Some of the dangers explored by Wyatt, right? And falling out of favor, being sent to Ireland if you say the wrong thing. All right, so why go to all this trouble? Why banish all these people? Why have this big elaborate test set out to show off your pride and show off your daughter's loyalty and love to you? What does Lear want out of this situation that's so important? So at line 133, he talks about the ourself by monthly course. So we talked about that a little bit earlier, what he wants, right? He wants to party, he wants to travel, he wants to essentially retire from being a king while still getting all the benefits. And we learned in Act 1, Scene 3 that he's out hunting, right? He has a retinue of 100 people that follow him around that he likes to party with. So think about this, right? Is this what a king should be doing in his older years? Or has he earned it? Has he earned it? So line 133, I want to turn back to that real quick. Our self-by-monthly course with reservation of 100 nights, so I want 100 nights with me. By you to be sustained, shall our abode make with you by due turns. So he's saying, I'm going to trade houses. I'm going to go stay with Goneril for a little while, and then I'm going to go stay with Reagan. I'm going to flip back and forth. Okay? So I don't care that you're a grown-up lady with a husband, and with your own court and your own issues to deal with. I'm going to just go crash at your place, right? So get the guest room ready for 100 nights, and me. Only we still retain the name and all additions to a king, the sway, revenue, execution of the rest of beloved sons be yours. So he wants the name and the additions of the king. So he wants all the fancy clothes, he wants all the respect, right? But he doesn't want any of the work. This last line here is important. This coronet part betwixt you. So he hands off this crown, right? Again, this idea of parting something that's whole. Now the crown is supposed to symbolize something eternal, right? An eternal circle that can't be broken, like a wedding ring. He's saying, let's part this crown. Let's part this crown. So there's already an issue here. There's also this question that the crown brings up about where authority lies. So is it in the crown? Is it in the retinues or the retinue of followers, the knights that are loyal to you that could defend you? Is it in the map, the representation of the space or the land? Is it the land itself? Is it maybe the body of the king? Right? We go back to those king's two bodies. Right? That issue about the body politic and the body natural. So where do we put the authority for kingship here? This brings this into question. It also brings into question the way kingship is crafted in a very much theatrical sense. Right? It can be crafted through props, like a crown or a throne or a map. It can be used on the stage. What is there to it? Is it ultimately empty? Right? issues we've already addressed in the class, such as Elizabeth's speeches and the king's two bodies. And Lear is equally interested in the king's body in this play, right? King Lear is interested in this. And the extent to which the body is human, mortal, fallible. And we'll see this really come to a head in the second half of the play, right? The way the king's body is, and we're asked to face that and confront it in a very human way. So in thinking about authority in this body natural, King Lear also emphasizes the tension between nature and artifice. And we already saw this a little bit, right, in Cordelia's speech about that glib and oily art. So there's something negative about artifice and about art here. Does that mean that nature is its opposite and that nature is a good thing that we can look to as a guide? And this play definitely brings up that question. Now Edmund, our bastard, most clearly articulates this tension between art, artifice, and nature. This is our stand up for bastards scene. Act 1, Scene 2. So he starts Act 1, Scene 2. Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Right? So nature, I'm going to follow you. Now normally we'd think, okay, this is going along the course of nature. This is a good thing. But here, Edmund is starting to twist this to a more sinister purpose. He uses this speech to speak directly to the audience. Right? He's alone on stage. This is our kind of Hamlet-esque soliloquy almost here in this moment, which brings up some questions, right? So normally when a character speaks directly to us, we're rooting for them. We think, oh, like this person is telling me his inner thoughts and inner feelings. I can trust them. I can get behind him. I can root for him. But he's telling us, I'm going to throw my brother under the bus. Right? I'm going to throw my brother under the bus. When Edmund is first introduced, this is page 1255, way back in 1-1. He's introduced with a lot of dirty puns, right? So his father keeps talking about him. He had fun, a good sport of his making. He came saucily into the world. Edmund's been listening to this the whole time. He says, do you know this gentleman, Edmund? And Edmund replies, line 25, no, my lord. He's been listening to him, essentially ridicule him and talk about how much fun it was having sex with his mom, right, the whole time. He's probably heard this before. So we may not be too surprised to see him say, stand up for bastards. In Act 1, Scene 2, we can finally get him alone. It's interesting to look at the way the language works in this speech as well. So his language starts to disintegrate. This is line 10. Why brand they us with base, with baseness, bastardy, base, base? He's repeating himself. It's getting a little out of control. This litany of rhetorical questions, right? It's starting to kind of fray for us. And he does this again when he talks about legitimate. Fine word, legitimate. As to legitimate, well, am I legitimate? He's getting a little out of control here. So the way language is mimicking a character's inner thoughts and feelings, fury, control, those kinds of issues are also coming out in this speech as well. By the end of the scene, Edmund has further disintegrated. So as he started saying, base, wherefore base, why bastard, bastard, base, base. Right, by the end of the scene, he's disintegrated into prose. So he's starting with poetry and then he's in prose. This is the excellent foppery of the world. This is line 115. That when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeit of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars. So sometimes when we're down on our luck, when we're at the bottom of fortune's wheel, we blame nature. We blame the sun. We blame the stars. Like, oh, I'm just a Taurus, right? So that's just in my nature. And we think he's going to say, this is a bad thing, right? We blame others. We blame nature for our actions. But he actually uses this to advantage. He says, I was conceived under the dragon's tail. I'm a nativity under Earth's nature, so it follows I'm rough and lecherous. So he embraces this way that nature and the natural world can shape personalities. Of course, in doing this speech, we're questioning to what extent does he have agency to choose, right? So this brings up the issue of class mobility here. The reason I put the fortune's wheel up here is because it's an issue that's talked about in this scene as well. That if you're on the bottom, you'll eventually get to the top, and if you're on the top, you're going to move to the bottom, right? Fortune turns the wheel. There she is. There she is. So, you know, we play Wheel of Fortune now before Jeopardy. This is actually where this is coming from. Edmund is an outwardly mobile figure here, right? He's this bastard who's been sent away and then is making his own way in the world, right? He's saying, I'm going to get your land, but you're watch out, I'm coming out for you. up for himself when he's been insulted repeatedly. So we're kind of asked to question this, right? These are the values of the Renaissance man, where we can climb our way to the top, right? But we're seeing Edmund as a villain. There's tension there. He also imagines himself as a very theatrical character. So this is line 132 of Act 1, Scene 2. He talks about Edgar entering like a catastrophe of the old comedy. My cue is villainous melancholy. So he talks about himself as an actor here. And he uses a lot of devices of actors, right? So later in one of the following scenes, he cuts himself, right? Like, oh, this will look better if I have real blood on me, so I'm going to cut myself. Right? So it's blurring this divide between acting and reality. Like when you cut yourself, you're actually cutting yourself. Or is it fake, right? Is it stage blood? Is he all just playing a role? So these questions of theatricality are something that he's very self-consciously addressing here as well. So ultimately, these questions about the Wheel of Fortune, mobility, movement around this wheel, connect to some of the larger themes of the play that the Fool plays around with regarding reversals of fortune and mobility, and the tension between being authentic and performing a role, which is something we see as Kent takes on a disguise, right, and as Edgar takes on a disguise as poor Tom. So in 1-4, Lear the Fool engaged in a number of riddles. So the Fool is able to speak the truth to Lear because he is so low, right, on that Wheel of Fortune. The Fool tells Lear to take my coxcomb. I have a little picture of a 16th century fool here, so you can kind of imagine that. This connects the ideas of the trappings, the ornaments and symbols of identity and profession, right? The coxcomb is the kind of identifying feature of the fool. To the idea of selfhood. To what extent does the coxcomb make the fool? So this lowers Lear, right? The Wheel of Fortune starts to turn as he says, take my coxcomb. I'll dress you in the outfit of the fool. Right? It starts to question how we're turning on that wheel. And what role ornamentation, these extra flourishes, the trappings of the king, right, of clothing, have to play in that as well. So line 136 in Act 1, Scene 4, it's on page 1271. You see the fool playing with a little riddle here. That lord that counselled thee to give away thy land, complacent here by me, do thou for him stand. The sweet bitter fool will presently appear, the one in motley here, the other found up there. When Lear responds, dost thou call me fool, boy? Fool responds, all the other titles thou hast given away, that thou wast born with. So here we're going back to nature, right? What are we born with? What are we born with? The titles, the trappings are gone. These ornamentations are gone. What are we born with? It starts to equalize people a bit, too. It makes us a little uncomfortable, right? We're thinking about kings. Questioning the way identity is based in titles and worldly things. So when Lear encounters Goneril in Act 1, Scene 4 and is told off for the first time, he starts to doubt himself. This is page 1273, line 220. He says, doth any here know me? This is not Lear. Doth Lear walk thus, speak thus? Where are his eyes? Either his notion weakens, his discernings are lethargied. Ha! Waking? 'Tis not so. Who is it that can tell me who I am? Right? He asks a series of questions. And in this moment, he's asking them as rhetorical questions. Like, don't you know who I am? Right, that kind of thing. But these questions start to undermine him. Right? Because in asking that question, he's raising the issue. He's raising the possibility that who is it that can tell me who I am? Who am I? Right? That question's being opened for him. So he starts in rhetorical, then it actually becomes a real question that he's posing. Goneril wants Lear to stop beating her servants and causing such a mess with his 100 followers. And this warrants his curses that she never have children, that they'd be absolutely terrible, how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have an ungrateful child. And I'd like to ask you guys the question just to think about whether you feel this is warranted or not. So her complaint to him in 235 is, here do you keep 100 knights and squires, men so disordered, so debauched and bold, they're drunk and they're groping my ladies, right? That this our court, infected with their manners, shows like a riotous inn. Epicurism and lust makes it more like a tavern or a brothel than a graceful place. And so she's complaining about his followers and their behavior. And then his response to her in line 274 is very impassioned. Here, nature, here, dear God is here. So he's calling on nature now, right? Suspend thy purpose if thou didst intend to make this creature fruitful. Into her womb convey sterility, dry up in her the organs of increase, and from her derogate body never spring a babe to honor her. Okay? So he's calling on nature to pervert nature, to go against nature. Calling on you, nature, to prevent her from reproducing. Of course, when we're thinking about kingship, inheritance, the lines of inheritance, that's all we want, right? Think about Henry VIII. We want children. Right? So for him to curse her in this way, it really cuts to the quick, not just of her as a woman, but also her as a queen. So in the play, children fell in and out of favor with wild abandon. First we have Cordelia, then Goneril, then we see a similar thing happen to Edgar. And in Act 2, Scene 3, Edgar disguises himself as poor Tom. And he says, this is line 6, I will preserve myself. This is as he's taking off his clothes and smearing mud all over his face. I will preserve myself with presented nakedness. So it's presented, it's out there, but it's also in that sense needed performed, right? Presented nakedness. By the end of his speech, he says, Edgar, I nothing am. This is page 1285. I will preserve myself. Edgar, I nothing am. It's this idea of where does that self reside? In order to preserve oneself, you have to efface yourself. You have to completely rid yourself of everything, empty yourself, right? Nothing, become nothing, in order to preserve yourself. So there's this kind of contradiction happening here. These themes are also explored by Kent, who serves Lear royally in disguise. And the irony of these disguises is that these characters must use disguises in order to remain true and loyal to their king. So the king has, in a way, engendered a whole series of deceptions. In order to be an authentic and honest subject, they must play a part. So again, you have these issues of theatricality, right? Performance. To what extent is performance accepted, right? If we're critiquing performance and saying it's always negative, right? That flippant way of the art, then what do we do with the fact that this is a play, right? That's supposed to be teaching us something, or that we're supposed to be getting something from. So there's this tension here. And this tension was part of a larger discourse in the period that was headed by these anti-theatrical writers who were often very vehement Protestants, kind of the same vein as the Puritans, right? The Pats that came over to New England here, because they were so pissed off at how things were going over in England. So this debate about to what extent can we perform? If you're watching a play, does that make you sinister? Is that going to make you lie? Right? Our performance is always just lies, or can they actually speak the truth in telling those lies? Questions, again, that those disguises bring up. In order to preserve myself, I have to kind of go under the knife and disguise myself here. So in Act 2, Scene 4, Lear is driven out. And as we see poor Tom Edgar, right, start to debase himself, we also see Lear starting to debase himself. So if you think back to that speech I showed you with the rhetorical questions, right, who is it that can tell me who I am? That starts to open that space for actual questioning. We also see actions now turning into, these feigned actions turning into real actions. This is page 1289, Act 2, Scene 4, line 150. He's scoffing at the idea that he asked Goneril's forgiveness, because he stomped away, right? He's cranky, he stomped away, like, I'm going to go stay with Reagan. She'll let me party with my 100 knights. And he says, ask her forgiveness. Do you but mark how this becomes the house? Dear daughter, I confess that I'm old, and he kneels here, right? He actually kneels here. Age is unnecessary. On my knees I beg that you'll vouchsafe me raiment, bed, and food. Now he's being sarcastic here. He's making fun of this, right? Look how this becomes the house. You really want to see me kneel? But he's actually kneeling, right? So just like those rhetorical questions open the space to actually ask the questions, who am I? This action starts to open the space for Goneril and Reagan to team up on him. Well, he's low now. We have a fortune, right? He's low now. He's literally low, right? He's on his knees. So Goneril and Reagan team up on Lear in his weakness. They take him down from 100 followers to 50, to 25, to 10. And then finally, we get this great line, what need one, right? What need one? 1, page 1292. What need you 5 and 20, 10 or 5, to follow in a house where twice so many have a command to tend you, Reagan, what need you? Then we get this great speech, right? We get Lear, oh, reason, not the need. He's talking about the way that, in this speech, the way that we really don't need anything, right? We're just animals underneath. The basest beggars are in the poorest things superfluous. Right? The basest beggars don't really need anything. It's reason, not the need. He calls on nature again. Nature needs not what thou gorgeous wearest. So again with the clothing, right? Nature, in nature you don't need clothes, but you wear it anyways. It's reason, not the need. His language starts to disintegrate at the end. Line 277. I will have such revenges on you both, that all the world shall, I will do such things, what they are, yet I know not. Okay, so there's these dashes, these pauses. He can't come up with a solution. He can't grant that authority, right, to say, this is what needs to happen, that kingly authority. That has fallen away, right, into these dashes. This language itself is starting to disintegrate for him here. Just like we saw earlier with Edmund. Bastard, base, wherefore base? Right? Same kind of thing happening here. We're getting out of control. Right? He doesn't know where to go. So perhaps we can read this as the beginning stages of dementia. Right? Some people have performed it that way. Perhaps this reveals just true emotion, like you're so frustrated you can't say anything. Perhaps this also speaks to the way the play unfolds. Right? Because we don't know what will happen next. What they are, yet I know not. We don't know. So Act 2 ends with the storm rolling out. Right? The very last line, come out of the storm. They're shutting up the house. Lear has ridden off, right, into the wilderness, ridden off into the heath, and the storm is rolling in. So this brings up some of the ideas. Oh, and I want to put that up here. Reason, not the need. Enjoy that. So this brings up some ideas about enclosure, inside versus outside. We've seen this before in Beowulf, right? The contrast between the inside of the hall and the scary outside, Grendel looking in from the outside. We have these same ideas coming up here, and it's appropriate because this is a mythic past of Britain. Right? So we have this connection to this mythic past, perhaps is evoking that kind of Beowulfian feel, the inside and the outside, as the storm rolls in. We have to ask the question, is nature something wild or is it something helpful? Right? Nature, thou art my goddess. Here, nature, here. And then here the storm is rolling in. To what extent is the storm created by Lear, right? Created by his language? And we'll see this starting to come into play in Act 3. And I'd also like to then ask you guys the question to think about to end the class with, which is how would an audience experience the storm in a 1606 open-air Globe theater? We're open to the elements, right? So we're told, here, close up the doors. Go inside. Do these things. But ultimately, we're outside, right, as audience members. We're outside with you. We're in the elements. We've got the open air. We've got nature here, right? So we have to confront that duality as well. Are we inside? Are we outside? And there's a tension that this play really starts to bring to a head, and that we'll see really come to a head in Act 3 in the storm. Thanks.
Looking at me?
Do you have your phone?
I feel like I understand Farewell a lot more, but I'm having kind of in trouble like finding another element or two to focus on. So I like